Good morning, everyone, or likely wherever you are. Good evening. Hopefully, you had a good Monday. I'm on the West Coast of the United States, and so my Monday is just getting started. Um, Today, I'm really excited to talk to you guys because we're going to talk about one of the most challenging aspects of your application or your personal statement, your admissions writing materials, and that's how to deal with failures, or blemishes within your application. All right, so I'm calling this one tough stuff. Next. All right, so who am I? I'm Brian Phoebe, and I'm the CEO of a company called GuruFi. And we work with applicants like you who are applying to business schools who particularly need help with the writing aspects of their application. So, personal statements, we also help people with CVs, some of the short answers that a lot of business schools require. We can help you with that. I have a JD and a PhD. I've taught for over 2 decades, et cetera, et cetera. Won some awards for as a writing professor at Harvard, but now I focus full time on helping business school applicants to make their essays as powerful as possible. Last year, we had a lot of success. Most years, we have a lot of success. We sent some students to Harvard Business School, Wharton, INSEAD, Oxford, Syed, Stern. Most years, we end up sending people into some of the top schools. So we got a great track record in that regard. Next. What we do, like I said, we focus on the writing aspect of applications. And, this is much more than just a glorified spell check. We work with you on structure, flow, content shortcomings, and really focus on this idea of making sure that your personal statements do a great job of telling your story, that the storytelling elements really pop out. All right. So like I said, today we're going to talk about failure. And it's one of the most challenging aspects of the application for a lot of reasons. But the place that I want to start is for you to have kind of a big picture view of the idea of failure and why it shouldn't scare you or scare you away from this business school application process. The first thing to understand and to accept is that everybody fails. All right. And especially successful people fail. And I'm going to return to this idea at a couple different points in this presentation. Second thing is obviously most people are uncomfortable talking about it. A failure can be a painful experience in your life. It can be difficult, and so reliving that in an essay is deeply uncomfortable. And so that discomfort can make it hard to write about and hard to convey exactly what you were thinking or how you came out of it and why you are still a good applicant or why you're even maybe a better applicant because of your failure. And the last thing is that most applicants wrongly assume that everyone who's applying to a school is like this perfect applicant who has made no mistakes. And therefore, if you have a bad thing in your application, that just sinks your chances of admission. And, you only see the good things in other people who have gotten into the schools that you want to get into. And you're not necessarily familiar with the fact that a lot of times they've had struggles and setbacks. And there are parts of their application or their lives that aren't so perfectly glowing. And once you accept that and realize that and embrace the idea that your own application can have blemishes or difficulties, then that can help you to frame how you approach this next this phase of your application. All right. So to start with, kind of here are some kinds of failures that some of you might be concerned about. Some of you will have poor grades, right? Fairly straightforward. Subpar test scores, gaps in your career. That's not always like a failure so much as something you just have to kind of explain, but we'll get back to that. Academic discipline, right? So if you either failed out of a school or got kicked out of a school for some reason or another. And then, the last one is professional failure. So you were fired, demoted, you had a business that you started that ended up failing. Those are all kinds of things that will give people pause as they go into their application process in terms of things that they're flagging that say, oh, this is terrible, it's going to sink my application. But for the most part, that's generally not true. So your challenge then as an applicant is to try to get around what is a lot of times a conflict that people can feel, which is that the personal statement and other application materials are meant to show the best version of yourself, right? This is this is your chance to say in your own words why you're a strong applicant, why you should be admitted. And therefore, like if you talk about failure, the thought is, aren't you sabotaging yourself? Aren't you undermining the very thing that you were attempting to accomplish? All right. So that said, if you're wondering why I should even mention failure, right? There are a couple of different reasons why it's important to talk about failure in your application. The most important, or the most straightforward one rather, is sometimes you will actually be asked straight away, like, talk about your biggest failure. That's a common-ish question that you will be asked in an application essay. And if you're not asked in an application essay, it's also something you should think about, by the way, because a lot of times for schools that have interview processes, this is something that will come up. They'll ask you to talk about your biggest failure. And so if you haven't thought about it and haven't processed it and thought about how you can do that, then that can really throw you off guard. The second thing is you want to control the conversation. You want to provide the lens, the frame through which people understand all parts of your application. So if it's something that the admissions committee is going to know about, it's much better that you provide the explanation, the context, and the frame, because they're not just going to ignore it. And so what do I mean by this? If, for example, you had, your first year at university, you didn't do well and you got poor grades and you did well afterwards, well, you might be inclined to say, well, let me just not bring this up because it's not something I'm proud of. But here's the problem. The admissions committee will see that. Right? They will look through and they say, oh, John didn't do well in his first year. Now, you might say, well, they should be able to figure out that I did better moving forward. And part of that is true. But the problem is you don't want to leave that as an open question, right? You tell them, say, look, I know this is something you're going to see. It's something that in the committee meetings, they will oftentimes have conversations about. And they'll say, why did he fail 3 classes in his first 2 years at university? So it's much better for you to provide the explanation, because the admissions committee is not going to do that homework for you, right? Sometimes I think, what admissions committees do is much more like they are an exclusion committee. They're trying to find ways in pools of highly qualified applicants to start excluding people. And so if there's some part of your application that gives them an excuse to exclude you, then they're going to do that. They're not going to try to figure out why you struggled or why it happened. You need to provide that explanation for them. You need to control that conversation. You need to provide that frame. Third point, there are ways that you can use failure to your advantage. When it's properly deployed in an essay, failure can show positive qualities: growth, potential, resilience, adaptability, optimism. Those are all things that, for the most part, can really only occur in the aftermath of a setback. And so if you want to demonstrate these things in your application, it can be wise to think about which failures you can use or which setbacks you can use in your essay in order to really emphasize your strengths. Lastly, it shows that you try. If you've never failed at anything, you've probably never really explored the horizons of your potential. And so one of the things that in an application you can think about, right, is that if you're applying to Stanford Business School or Harvard Business School, one of the ways that you can explain your desire to go to business school is you say, look, I was a good student, but I founded this company and it had certain types of failures. It failed for these particular reasons. I know that the idea is still good. I still have an entrepreneurial fire in my belly, but I also recognize that there are some discrete skills that I need to be able to use in my entrepreneurial life that I can only get from business school, right? And so it demonstrates that you are moving forward. All right. So 3 tips for handling failure. The number one most important tip is not to psych yourself out. Okay. There's this, old Michael Jordan quote. I think Wayne Gretzky said something similar. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. All right. And so if you say, well, I failed, there's no reason for me to try. What I can tell you is that you're either right or you're wrong. All right. If you're right that this particular failure is going to keep you out of business school, if you apply to business school, you're in the exact same position as if you didn't apply, right? You lose nothing by trying. All right. But if you're wrong, then if you don't apply, then you will have lost the chance to do something really great. And so, obviously you want to think about having a smart application strategy overall, but don't defeat yourself. Don't do the job of the admissions committee for them of saying, I'm just going to exclude myself just because there's something that you're a little bit concerned about in your application. Second thing is what I call the forum superstars. And these aren't always just in forums. These are also people that you'll meet along the way. Is that, in a forum, people will tell you like, oh, you can't get into such and such a school. Or, someone might tell you like, this is, an application has to have these things. And you have to be, if you want to get into Wharton or Stanford or Stern or whatever, you have to be this absolutely perfect candidate. That's just not true. Okay. And again, you should remember that you need to do your best in order to position yourself for success. And then finally, as I noted before, if you can afford it, if you have time to put together a genuinely thoughtful application, and if you make contingency plans, hold on one second, sorry. Hey, Lane, Daddy is giving a presentation, so you need to go upstairs, okay? Sorry about that. So we're all living with COVID, and my kids are here, and yeah. So at any rate, if you can afford it and you can put together a genuinely thoughtful application, and this is all to say that like take a chance on some of these like higher ranked or more prestigious schools, but also understand that you do need to also take into account that maybe some of these failures will hurt your application a little bit, and so look to safety schools or backup plans if you end up getting rejected. All right. The first thing you need to think about in this process is your failure a big failure or is it just a blemish? And the reason it's important to understand is that there are different strategies and approaches that you will use. Hold on one second. Lane, you need to go upstairs now. Sorry about that. Yeah. If it's a big failure, then this is like, for example, if you are, say, 5 or 6 years out of undergrad, you've had a good career, but your undergraduate grades were just really poor across the board. You weren't a strong student back then. You were expelled from university, or you had a startup that just went bankrupt, something big. That's like a big failure, and there's a different strategy we're going to talk about for that. Second is that just a blemish? You were a good student, but maybe you failed in one course, or you have a solid application otherwise, professionally, academically, etc., but your test scores weren't quite up to standard. So those are two very different kinds of failures. If it's a blemish, this is the much more straightforward one. All right, so I say like use this 5-step process for figuring out how to address the blemish in your application. So first, explain the failure bluntly, specifically, directly, and clearly. All right, don't use euphemism or illusion, and I'll give an example of this in a second. Second, own it and explain why it happened. Third, explain what you learned from it. Fourth, reassure the reader it won't happen again and why. And fifth, if this is possible, it's not always possible given like the timeline of your application or of your life, etc. If possible, provide an example of subsequent success. Usually, you put this in like at the very end of that, where you talk about how and why it is that the previous failure is something that you've avoided subsequently. And I'll show you what I mean here. All right, so here's an example of what I might call a blemish paragraph. All right, it says, before concluding, please allow me to draw your attention to one aspect of my application that may have given you some concern. In my final year of university, I earned a D in advanced data mining. All right, so notice what's happening here is you're being specific. You're not saying, I had a bad grade. All right, or I performed poorly in one semester. Right, be precisely, specifically in how you address the challenge, right? I accept full responsibility for this misstep. So you say you own it, right? This is a mature response to a mistake. Then you provide an explanation for it. So the final for this class occurred a week after my cousin was hospitalized because of car accident. As a result, I returned home because I had performed well in the class to that point, and I assumed I could take the final without studying and earned a poor grade. This was a poor decision on my part, and I recognize that I should have spoken with my professor so that I might have taken the exam at a later date. In fact, during my master's degree studies, I had to have ankle surgery in the aftermath of a skiing accident. And I made a point of contacting my professor so that I could have the time I needed to recover. More broadly, I hope that you will note that this one grade does not align with my broader record of academic and professional excellence, and it is my hope that you will thus assess my record holistically. So a couple of things that I want to note here. As I noted, very specific in identifying what exactly happened, right? Second, you own it. You say, like, yes, I accept responsibility for this. And then goes on to say, look, here's what I would have done differently. I should have talked to my professors, right? And then here's the thing that I was talking about. If you can do it, you say a similar situation occurred again, and I actually took a different approach. So I again had a challenge within a semester, kind of a personal thing that happened. I hurt myself, but this time I used a different approach. I spoke to my professors and I made sure that everything was okay academically so that I could still perform well. And what this paragraph does is says, okay, we understand that everybody makes mistakes and there was this one thing that happened this one time. It's explained. You also point out that, look, if you look at the broader scope of my application, this is still this is very much out of line with what everything else that's happened. So this just shows that a single mistake won't sink your application, and the reader is much more likely to understand that that one poor grade was much more a deviation from the norm than an indication of an academic weakness with you. All right, so that's how you handle a blemish. So here's how to think about how you can handle a big failure, okay? And here's what I always say is what you can't fix feature, all right? And what I mean by that is instead of running from the problem, make it part of your story. Just be upfront and kind of it's not a trick, but it's a psychological or it's a narrative move where you take something that is a weakness and you turn it into a potential strength or a potential narrative thread for your application, right? And so the example that I use sometimes is like trying to hide something that the committee will know about as like a bald man with a bad comb over, right? It draws attention to the problem, it makes it worse, and is ultimately counterproductive. And so, if you see people who are balding, a lot of times the best move is just to shave your head, right? And say, look, right, go the Jeff Bezos route and say, look, I'm losing my hair, doesn't matter, I'm bald now, I'm still awesome. And so you simply like make it a positive feature instead of making it something that you're ashamed of or hide from. And I'll give you an example here. All right. So how do you handle a big feature? How do you feature a big failure rather? The way that I think about it is if you've watched some of the previous YouTube that I've done, and I'd encourage you to do that because there's some great storytelling tips, et cetera, in there. It's sort of like you should think about your application like a movie. Start your story at the lowest point and make the rest of the essay about growth and triumph. All right. And if you think about the movies that you like, it's usually the case that if the hero or the protagonist in that movie never if they never face anything difficult, then it's not a very compelling movie. And in the movies that you do like, it's usually that the hero has had some struggles and then they end up having this great success or face impossible odds and overcome them. And that's kind of the vibe that you want to strive for in your own essay. Next. All right. So here's an actual real client that I worked with. And they were really worried about the fact that they some years ago were working at Google and they got fired and they didn't really know how to work with that. And so I said, okay, let's not hide from it. All right, let's talk about where this fits in with your career trajectory. So we actually introduced their essay with the fact that working at Google was their dream job. And when they got fired, they were absolutely devastated. And it gave them some sense of doubt about themselves and their capacity, but they refused to give up. All right, so that's the starting point. Right off the bat, you put out the worst part of your application. You're fired from Google. From there in the essay, you say, okay, how do I figure out how to improve? All right. You take the feedback that you got from your job, you figure out, was I a good fit for that? What was I good at my job? What was I poor about? How can I end up creating a career for myself that best fits who I want to be and what I want to become? And so in this instance, the client sort of understood that they were not a great employee, but they really loved the entrepreneurial aspects of work. And so they started their own company. And so they said, even though I had my doubts, I refused to give up. And they started their own company. The company was successful. And they sort of wrapped up the essay with an acknowledgement of the fact that their success never would have happened if they hadn't have gotten fired from Google. And so here you have this aspect of your application, which a lot of people would think is like the weakness of the application, or this terrible thing that happened is like you have to explain why after 14 months they got fired from Google. It ends up being a strength because it shows a subsequent growth. And the company that they started was really interesting, doing cool things. And so again, it turns something that maybe some people would want to hide from the admissions committee and say, no, they're going to ask about this gap in my career and like why I was there for not very long. I'm going to go ahead and show them and turn this into a strength. All right. And this client ended up having great success in their admissions process. Next. All right. Again, this is an actual client, and they had a big academic failure. All right. So in their sophomore year, they failed out of university. And they said, you know, I failed out of university, and therefore I thought that I just was not going to be successful academically and professionally. And so they took the first job that they could find, and it was working at a neuroscience lab, as it turned out. And in the process of overhearing the scientists talk, they became interested in doing their own research and studies. Hold on again. Hey, Lane. I have a very naughty daughter who doesn't want to behave herself. I'm going to need you to go in the playroom because Daddy is doing work, okay? Go play with Garrison.
No, I don't want to play with Garrison.
Welcome to life in the era of COVID. Yeah. So they assumed that they were going to be a failure. They took a job at a neuroscience lab. They began working with the scientists, and they actually became really interested in scanning electron microscopes, right? And from there, they started working on a software package, and they founded their own. Sorry again, 1 second. Oh man, I'll tell you what. All right, but you know what? This is sort of like an application process, and everything doesn't always go smoothly, but you do what you can. All right. So anyway, to finish this client's story, they founded a software company that made software for scanning electron microscopes, and they completed their undergraduate degree at night. And they were having success, and they wanted to go into an executive MBA, right? And they said, look, I got D's and F's my first 2 years in university. Why is any prestigious program at all going to accept me? And so I said, look, here's what you do. You talk about the trajectory of your career, and you talk about the role that failure played in your journey. And they ended up having fantastic success. Because they were basically able to say, look, at 20 years old, I was not mature, and failure ended up being the dose of the real world that I needed in order to find my way. And that's a narrative that admissions committees understand and are able to process and work with. Next. All right. Now, one of the things that you will also get a lot of times is like a biggest failure essay. And some of the things that I've talked about also apply here. So again, think of this like a movie, be concerned about storytelling, etc. The other things to keep in mind, though, is first is sometimes applicants take this biggest failure essay prompt too literally, right? And they'll write an essay where basically all they do is talk about how they failed, right? And there is no growth or redemption at the end. So don't do that. The point of the essay isn't to just, give a sad story where you got knocked out and then that's just the end of it. Rather, what I want you to do kind of in your mind is to transform the prompt from what was your biggest failure to how did I recover and learn from my biggest failure? Okay. And the other tip I'll make here is the same thing that happens in interviews when people ask you to talk about your biggest failure. Make it a real failure. Don't say something like, oh, I just cared too much, or I was I was too effective. I was too compelling as a leader. Those type of fake failures that are actually just humble brags, right? You boasting about how good you are. Make it an actual failure so that you can show how it is that you recovered from an actual authentic setback. Next. For biggest failure essays, I would divide it into 3 parts. All right. One, what was the failure? So here's where you talked about what happened, what your role was, and what mistake you make. Second, you talk about how did you recover from the failure and what did you learn? And there's 2 different ways that you can go with part 3, depending on the details of your story. So either one is you provide an example where you faced a similar problem and you didn't fail, right? Or you can talk about how, actually, there's a typo here, where you talk about how you faced a similar problem, or you can talk about if you face a similar problem, rather, how you plan to react to that, right? So this depends entirely upon the trajectory of your career as to whether or not you've actually had this challenge. All right, next. All right, so here's a condensed version of a failure essay, all right? So it says, for example, in this kind of, again, this is shrunk down from about 600 words. First part where you talk about your failure. When my boss asked me to run a parse analysis of the company we were looking to acquire, I was too embarrassed to admit that I didn't know how. So rather than admit this, I went online and watched several YouTube videos on the subject. I foolishly assumed this would be enough, but when my boss saw my work product, he was irate because it contained several massive formatting and data errors and was completely unusable. I was mortified and recognized what an enormous error I made. I began enrolling in a 5-week online course in parse analysis, but more importantly, I resolved to be open in my communications, especially when I needed help. All right. So the first part is that they acknowledge what the problem is, and then they go on to say how they went about resolving the challenge that this created. All right. And the third part is where a similar challenge comes up. And say several months later, another of my supervisors asked me to run a parse analysis, and this time I possessed the technical skills to do so. But when I ran into a few problems with the project's data formatting, I first asked a coworker, then went to my boss to explain the problem. I sat down with her, and the 2 of us worked through this together. She appreciated my honesty and told me, while very few junior account managers have the experience to solve this kind of problem, even fewer have the honesty to admit it. My commitment to a collaboration, she reassured me, had saved the project. Again, so what happened here is first, third, you just talk about what the problem was. Second, your reaction to it. And third, when a similar type of situation occurred, it shows how you handled it better and ultimately had success this time, whereas the first time you failed. Next. All right. So this is the second kind of example that's, again, condensed from a much longer essay. When we founded DigiMove, we felt confident in our business. We had secured funding to pay expenses for another year, and I was excited to go into business with my best friend of 10 years. We eschewed normal titles and roles. Again, I'm very sorry.
Brian, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Sorry for this, everybody. As you can tell, for COVID, I'm working from home, and nanny issues have forced the kids not to be very obedient here. So I appreciate your patience. So failure essay example 2. When we founded DigiMove, we felt confident in our business. We had secured funding to pay expenses for another year, and I was excited to go into business with my best friend of 10 years. We eschewed normal titles and roles, and instead decided that we would operate on consensus, with all 10 of the original founders having to agree on major moves. Within months, small disagreements paralyzed the company, bickering became rife, and our company structure didn't empower anybody to step in and take control. Predictably, within 18 months, we were out of business. All right, there's the problem. Now you talk about how you worked through that problem. All right. It says, in the aftermath of this failure, I recognized that we were naive to believe that our friendship could solve all problems. In fact, the irony is that Had we found a way to create a structure and culture that prioritized traditional business roles, our company and our friendship would have thrived. This made me appreciate how a great business idea can only go as far as the company's culture, structure, and leadership allow. So you had a failure and you learn from it. Now, what's different from the previous example is that in this example, you don't have a person who then goes on to found a second company and that shows how they had success with it. Rather, they're sort of looking forward to the next challenge, even though they haven't had another iteration where they have solved this original challenge. And here's what I mean. They say, I've not given up on entrepreneurship. Quite the contrary. I'm excited to launch a revised and improved version of DigiMove, but this time I want to use best practices that I acquire from an elite business school. At Johnson Business School, I will gain the kind of understanding of leadership, corporate structure, personnel management, and dispute resolution that I need to excel as an entrepreneurial leader. So here you have someone who is saying, look, I made this mistake. In the aftermath, I recognize what that mistake was. And as I look to the future, I know what I need to do in order to prevent that from happening again. So they haven't used this knowledge yet, but they have a clear idea of how they're going to move forward in the wake of this. And so again, this just depends on the nature of their life trajectory. So to wrap up, failing stinks, right? It's not anything that people want to go through, but the fact is it will happen to you. And maybe you're one of these applicants whose failure you worry will negatively impact your application. Okay. Business schools don't want flawless statues, and they understand that real human beings have setbacks, have missteps, and they appreciate experience. And oftentimes, experience means stumbling along the way. And sometimes scars are a sign of character. How you handle failing ends up being really important and can help your essay be more thoughtful, have better storytelling, and make your essay stronger because it shows that you have positive traits. All right. So don't let either a blemish or maybe a more major setback make you think that you don't have the capacity to go to business school, because there likely is a school out there who will value that experience as long as you're able to identify that school well and then work to make sure that you frame it within your application well. Next. If you have questions, you can go to gurufy.com or you can email direct me at gurufy@service.com. All right.
Can you open this for me?
1 second. Hey, Brian, I studied engineering in my bachelor's, but I didn't score much. I did absolutely no project in college otherwise. How can I talk about it in my... Oh my goodness, kids. All right. Studied engineering in bachelor's, but I didn't score much. I did absolutely no projects in college otherwise. So how can I talk about it in my application? So when you say that you didn't do projects, what precisely did you mean? Can you, I'm not sure if this is possible. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say you didn't do it projects? All right, we'll come back to that. All right. What if someone is an average person with average grades and average projects and achievements? How can they make their essay better? All right, so this is a slightly different type of challenge than what we're talking about today. What I'm talking about, some of the things I'm talking about today is how you handle setbacks. But here, one of the challenges is that if you feel like just kind of across the board, right? So you don't have any big failures, but you don't have any great success, then that's a little bit different. Part of that will come down to figuring out a way to match your achievements and your background to the essay or the school that you're applying to. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. My one day as a stay-at-home dad. All right. So here the challenge is a little bit different. If you don't have big failures and no success either, then part of that is there's kind of two parts to this. One, it may be, and again, I would have to kind of look at holistically your application, that you have to think about that in terms of the kinds of schools that you're going to be applying to. So if by your own description, what you're talking about is kind of like more mediocre, then if every part of your application is mediocre, then that is going to put a roof a little bit on the kinds of schools that you're applying to. All right. That having been said, let me offer this as like a general insight into the kinds of things that people first say to me when they sit down and they have a consultation. All right. Nearly all applicants that I work with say something along the lines of, I don't really have a very interesting story. In one of the previous YouTube videos I did here for GMAT Club, I talked about the fact that one of the things that often happens is when I sit down with people, they do have an interesting story. And so part of it is to actually figure out if there is some part of your life or your career or your trajectory or your dream for yourself that is interesting. All right. And either sit down with someone who doesn't know you, where you can sort of talk through what you've experienced and what you hope to do, or you can work with a professional, someone like me, who will work with you through that process. Because, one of the things that's often true is that most people don't think their own lives are very interesting, but when they actually talk to somebody else, they say, wait, tell me more about this thing that you just talked about, because that's actually really fascinating. And I think it could make the grounds for a really compelling essay. But like, if it's in fact true that like you've had no big failures and no great successes either, then it will be a little bit more work to try to mine out the things that you can use as the basis of an application that's really interesting and compelling. All right. Regarding the failure essays, do they more recent failure? Can it be 7, 8 years ago, which help you change? I don't necessarily think that the recency aspect of it is hugely important, except in this regard. If it's something that's 7 or 8 years ago, it can actually make for a really fantastic essay if you have 7 or 8 years of subsequent successes that you can link back to that failure, right? So the danger of saying, look, I had this failure 7 or 8 years ago, and then, you have over the next 7 years, you didn't really do anything different, then that's not really a compelling failure to use, because it says, oh, I failed and I didn't learn and I didn't adapt. But if, for example, 7 years ago, your first company went bankrupt, or you got fired from your job, or whatever happened, and then you then sort of had to look in the mirror and said, this isn't good enough. I have to refigure what I want to do, or I want to actually follow my passions, and you change your professional trajectory. Then when they look at your application now, they say, okay, look, in 2013, Karun got fired from, Digitech or whatever, or his company went bankrupt. But now he has this second company that he's doing, or he has these really interesting ideas. He's working at Google. He's done these cool things, and he's shown that he's made these adaptations and changes that logically do flow from that failure. All right. But again, if in the 7 or 8 years since that failure, you've done nothing different or new, then I would avoid it and try to come up with something that's maybe a little bit more recent. I'm in the pre-final year of undergraduate student. I'm currently working on my startup, but COVID-19 hit hard and we ended up burning a lot of money, but no sales. We're still working on it. I'm worried I might not be able to continue for long. I'll be applying to top deferred MBA programs next year. Wanted to ask how I should go about. Well, so here's what's true with COVID. And this is sort of an educated guess about what's about to happen. Less so this year, but certainly in like subsequent years. There are a lot of businesses that are failing, partly because of COVID. Some applications are already sort of asking, like, how has COVID impacted your business, affected your life, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that you can talk about in an essay like this, and obviously you'd have to kind of go a little bit deeper into talking about the nature of your business, et cetera. But if you say COVID, we had this business plan and COVID caused it to fall apart, the business, the admissions committee is going to understand what you're talking about, right? They're like, yeah, this has happened to tons of businesses. Um, Obviously, the more specific you can be about it, if you can talk about how COVID hurt, um, a particular aspect of what it undermined a certain market. It you know if the more specific you can be about how this happened, not just like, oh, COVID happened and everything went badly. You can still say like you can either say, look, I still believe in the potential for this company, or I still have an entrepreneurial thirst. But, and this is one of the things to think about, is going forward, I want to be able to build a company that is dynamic and robust enough to be able to withstand these types of unexpected events. And one of the things that a business school can do is to provide, insights into better risk assessment and leadership potential and planning, et cetera, so that you can do that. And in terms of like, again, you say, how do I go about compensating for that failure? I wouldn't necessarily think about it as like compensating for a failure, but instead like incorporating it into your story that you're part of this generation of young entrepreneurs who had this world changing event come and just like wipe everything away. And so how do you recover from this? Right. And you can find ways to infuse that into your approach and say, look, COVID was this unexpected thing that came and took out lots and lots of businesses. I still have this hunger to do this. I want to think about how I can keep, press forward with the next iteration of it, and think about it from that perspective. How to explain drop years and applications, which I had taken to prepare for undergraduate. So you're talking about like a gap year effectively between high school and university. For the most part in business school applications, I don't know that you do need to explain that. It's not terribly important. And if you do feel like you need to, it can usually be explained in a sentence or so. For graduate business schools, the thing that I usually say is anything that happened before university is really only important in terms of if it provides like a frame or a context. No university, I mean, you could have failed out of high school, but if you got to university and did well, no business school is going to really care. I don't think it's something that you should be terribly concerned about for a master's MBA. Let me find another question here. How to go about, let's see. Sorry, I'm just reading through these, trying to find a great example here. Leadership help me. So Karun provided some additional, he says, 7 years ago, I believed in sales. It was important to be a one-man army. I was supposed to do everything myself, failed in a few instances, continued, later reached out to colleagues more and the leadership team. This helped not only with order deal, but also better connect with leadership. All right. So, all right. Sorry. Yeah, says that's it. Any final thoughts? All right. Again, in terms of failures and setbacks, understand that in most instances, these are things that can be dealt with some sound strategy in your application writing. Try to find ways to think about how you can view this as a plus or a positive, and think of yourself as like the hero in your own essay. And as we saw today with kids running in and out, most people on admissions committees understand that life is complicated and it throws curveballs at you. And if you can handle it and press forward, then it will be something that shows that you have certain positive strengths. All right. So try to view it if you can from that perspective, and don't necessarily view it from the perspective of something that is going to wipe out your application. All right. So again, thank you for your patience. Sorry for the interruptions there. Like I said, COVID is making us deal with lots of strange things. If you have any questions, hit me up at service@gurufy.com or just come to the website. I hope this was instructional and informative for you, and check out my other videos. It's on the GMAT Club YouTube page. All right. Have a great, I guess it's night where most of you are. I'm going to go look after my kids now. All right. See you guys later.